solution to the problem. It's offering a vast natural carbon sink. It can offer vast resources. It can provide for production of food, transportation, electricity with zero emissions and with a much lighter environmental footprint than terrestrial activities. It can sort of serve to alleviate the root causes of its own problems. To do that, we have to have a holistic, comprehensive approach to the ocean. And not least when it comes to the coastal ocean zones, where the wind farms are to be placed. Because wind farms will be a vital contribution and part of the energy mix going forward. And of course, the offshore wind farms, they are offering compelling propositions. They can be situated outside of the coast, out of sight, out of mind, with less conflicts with nature, people, and biodiversity on shore. One important element is that, of course, they also inherently can contribute to democratization of access to clean and affordable and reliable electricity. As 150 coastal states are able to tap from wind resources off their coast. But to do so in a sustainable and responsible manner, we have to cooperate. And this is why we are so delighted today to launch the ClimateSmart Marine Spatial Planning concept, which Martha is showing here. It's a way of structuring an approach to how to scale up in a socially responsible manner, how the wind farm producers can gain both political and social license to operate, to avoid harming marine lives and habitats, and to avoid unnecessary conflicts with other industries operating in an increasingly busy ocean space, and also to do so in a manner which is not unduly affecting people's lives and livelihoods. So this is the way forward. It goes through cooperation, and our ClimateSmart MSP is hopefully a contribution to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And so I'd like to now pass on to Julien Barbier, my French accent, Head of Marine Policy and the Ocean Decade Focal Point at IEC UNESCO.
Thank you very much, Martha. I'm very happy to be with our two partner organization. So let's start with marine spatial planning before we get to climate smart, right? Because that's not an easy concept. In fact, it's maybe one of a challenge in terms of communicating vision. From our side, I've been working on MSP for over 50 years. We define this really as a multi-stakeholder process to organize and plan in a more rational and sustainable way ocean space. But this is also about providing a platform for different users to interact together and achieve this balance between sustainable economic development and the environmental objectives. It's about developing a common vision for ocean space. It's about having common objectives for the use, the conservation, and also the restoration of marine ecosystems. It's about providing a way to avoid conflicts among different users, finding synergies for activities that can collaborate and take place in the same space. It's about providing certainty for sustainable economic development through a concerted framework. It's about achieving ecological, economic, and social objectives through an adaptive framework. So I think I think MSP can also play a critical role in really achieving the mitigation and adaptation potential of the ocean, as Serga has just said. My organization has been, as I said, involved over 15 years in supporting countries around the world in providing technical support. We now have over 45 countries that are involved in MSP planning, plans, and we have a real strong momentum. Recently, we have a high-level panel on sustainability that also pushed for the 100% ocean managed. And I think this is all going in the right direction. Our work is framed in the context of an MSP roadmap, another roadmap that was launched in 2017 by the European Commission. And And one of the objectives was really also to articulate how MSP can be a tool to implement sustainable ocean economy. So I think this collaboration that we are having here today is one way to really try to get it. Last month, we published a new set of international guidelines on marine spatial planning to this for the MSP global project. And this provides basically really concrete guidance to countries on how to organize planning, how to organize institutional framework, the stakeholder participation process, building on over 20 years of implementation around the world. But of course, this is not enough. And I think we need to take that discussion at a much lower level and a much more higher resolution level. We need to work with different sectors to really understand their own demand for marine space and how we can really promote their participation in national MSP processes. And I think this is why we are certainly supporting this MSP ClimateSmart roadmap, because that is really what we need. And we need to develop this dialogue with other sectors as well, whether it's food, aquaculture, fisheries, the shipping, and all of this. And this is certainly something that my organization, will do in the coming years. I think MSP Smart, Climate Smart means finding a way to prioritizing space for activities that are pushing zero carbon or that are going to renewable energies. But it's also about ensuring that the ocean has a capacity to mitigate through carbon sequestration, marine protected areas, seaweed farming. So all of this have a space in the marine spatial planning process. My last point is really to say that marine spatial planning is also a very science-intensive process. So for that, we need to have the right science. We need to have the right observations so that we really understand the multiple stresses faced in the environment and how this translates into planning. We need better data, better integration of data, social and economic data, also involved to really inform the decision process. And we have a great vehicle for achieving some of those science goals, and this is the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. Thanks. So we're just very happy to have this dialogue with you, and we'll certainly like to continue this in the future as we advance.
Thank you so much, Julian. And I'm just also seeing there are some difficulties hearing. So I hope that you can hear a bit clearer. I'll try to speak more into the microphone and urge all speakers to speak into the mic, hoping that this is easier to hear. But thank you so much, Julian. I agree, our collaboration is really important, and I really look forward to working with you as well. So I will now pass over to Joyce Lee, who is the head of policy at GWEC, and to offer some of her remarks as well. Joyce.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Martha. So just to unpack a few of the acronyms, which will be liberally distributed throughout this discussion, GWEC is the Global Wind Energy Council. We're a nonprofit industry association promoting wind power, and one of the partners for this event. If I can take the liberty to say that it's a particularly powerful combination of organizations coming together behind this concept, with the UN Global Compact and its leadership in the SDG space for both state and non-state actors, and IOC UNESCO and its stewardship of oceans and social and economic development, and of course GWEC as the voice of the private sector. So we really appreciate the collaboration, and we'll hope that it continues very strongly after this event. Just a few words from that private sector perspective. We have a lot to be proud of in the offshore wind industry. We've seen incredible growth over the last decade to 35 gigawatts installed today. That's mostly across UK, Europe, and China, taking up most of the market in Asia. That's been driven by a number of factors: technology innovation, bigger and bigger turbines going into new sites, facing challenges in engineering as they move farther and farther out to shore. We've had dramatic cost reduction over the last decade as well. The levelized cost of electricity for offshore wind has dropped by nearly 2/3 over the last decade, and is predicted to continue declining by up to 50% over the next decade. And then, of course, we've had very strong policy support, including at some pretty credible national capacity targets that have been set, such as 45 gigawatts by 2040 in Japan, or 30 gigawatts by 2030 in the US. Ministry of Interior of the US was in the US Pavilion yesterday, speaking about this target and putting out a global call to raise offshore wind ambition, which of course we echo. So we have the policy support. We know we need to go farther. We have the economics, we have the technology. What we do need now is a sustainable plan to grow, to ensure that as offshore wind continues to scale up, and we are hoping to scale to, by order of magnitude, to as much as 380 gigawatts by 2030, as well as 2,000 gigawatts by 2050, in line with the IRENA and IEA net zero roadmaps that have been published for COP26 this year. As that happens, it's incredibly vital to ensure that it's happening in a way that minimizes any harmful impacts on the environment, that minimizes sector conflict with other ocean users, and that it ensures that we're putting sustainability at the heart of industry growth. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. I hope we can unpack what ClimateSpark marine spatial planning means to all these different stakeholders that we have. And with that, I will hand it back to myself.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And I very much think we will be able to unpack it given the great people that we have here today. So thank you so much and to all of you. And I'd like to ask you to take a seat at the front here. Thank you very much. And I would now like to invite our first panel to the virtual and to the actual stage. And with that, I'd like to invite Jay Borkland, who is the Director of Ports at Allen Renewables, to turn on his camera and unmute himself. And I would also like to invite Jörg, he is fantastic, who is the Director of Marine Environment Research at the Korea Maritime Institute. And on stage, I am joined by Alison Calden, who is the Program Specialist at IOC UNESCO. So thank you so much for joining. I'm just going to take a seat here. So this first panel is really kind of dedicated to firstly unlocking what climate-smart marine spatial planning means, and also to discuss with representatives from the public sector and from the private sector about how they can directly engage in a climate-smart MSP process. But firstly, maybe taking a step back, I'm very glad to see that our report has been handed out to a of you, because I think this will help guide the discussion today. But as sort of really well outlined by Julian, it's quite a technical sounding topic, but what we're really talking about here is how we manage our seas. How can we better manage our seas, and how can we ensure that this management is also responding to a changing climate? So key elements of a climate smart MSP is, as Julian mentioned, it's data driven. It's using the best knowledge to really ensure that planning is integrating changes from a changing climate. It's adaptive, it's innovative, it's considering climate change scenarios in its planning, stakeholder engagement processes are founded in climate literacy, ensuring that we're all coming and working from the same place. And it's also prioritizing space for climate solutions. So here we're talking about offshore wind as one of the key climate solutions to get and to reach the Paris Agreement, but it's also talking about smart use combinations with other important climate solutions like seaweed, like aquaculture, and other such nature-based solutions. And importantly, it's also including the socio-economic element. So using tools to ensure that planning is taking place at a scale and in an area where it can also benefit the local communities and also include them in that process. So that's just a little bit of background, but we're going to unpack that a little bit more. And I'd actually like to pose my first question to you, Jay. I'm just going to turn around and see you there. Nice to see you. So Jay, you have been involved from the very outset of the development of this roadmap. And I think it's really great to sort of understand a little bit more about the process of how we got to where we did, and why we deemed it as an important process, and why we felt that marine spatial planning was a lever for offshore renewable energy.
Well, thank you, Martha. And initially, I'd like to
hear anything at the moment. We'll just wait a little bit more. Maybe unmute.
Hi, Martha. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And so first, let's tackle, why important. Well, I mean, it's critical that we ensure that all uses of the ocean are synergistic, lest we overstress that very delicate resource. The UNGC and the UN has indicated through research that 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions could be curbed if offshore wind were built out to its um, fullest potential. And the UNGC decided that it wanted to address and attack really some of the barriers to that really climate smart approach to global planning, and recognize that marine spatial planning was one of the things that was a very important component. So the UNGC, in ways that only it can, rallied the global experts to identify ways to accelerate adaptation of ocean renewable energy, and identified marine spatial planning as one of the very important components. So a group of experts that includes the NGOs, industry, offshore wind industry, as well as the marine industry, finance, regulatory, government inputs, including all of the stakeholders that one might identify as using the ocean, including fisheries, aquaculture, shipping, recreation, transport, etc., into a panel to really kind of attack the concept that marine spatial planning needs to be in the forefront of thought if offshore wind and or other ocean renewable energy aspects are to be built out to their maximum potential. And so one of the things that a whole series of workshops were held, a whole group of, there were both group meetings and one-on-one meetings with interested parties. All of the thoughts were pulled together and distilled into what ended up being 8 key recommendations that came out of the work that was done. And that one of the things that really came out in the fore in recommendation number 7 was really the need that we can't ignore nature-based solutions, and that we need to incorporate that in the marine spatial planning aspects. It is in everybody's best interests to have those types of solutions incorporated. So biodiversity and natural solutions were very much in the forefront of the planning, the thought process, and putting the roadmap together. And the roadmap is now in its position where it can be used and can be adapted for, can be used to be adapted to for planning for a lot of different applications. And we're hoping that nations and industry combined will look at the roadmap and understand that the importance of the marine spatial planning in the overall aspect of the unlocking the key to renewable energy, which can then help meet the climate accords in Paris.
Thank you so much, Ben. I remember that conversation. I think we wanted to sort of say, bring MSP to COP. And I think we even had a phrase like MSP as the NDC for the ocean, which is maybe quite catchy. So thank you so much. I'm just going to pass over to you now, Alison. So obviously, Julien has given an overview of IUC's involvement in marine spatial planning. But now we're sort of getting into that kind of, people might have a different interpretation of what ClimateSmart MSP means. And so to make it very simple, what does it mean to you? And what could be some of the benefits of this approach?
Great question.
We have a spare mic.
All good. We have a spare mic. Fantastic. Well, first of all, it's really nice to be here. Very strange to be talking in front of a live audience instead of in front of a screen. Quite nice as well. So thank you for the invitation. So what does ClimateSmart MSP mean to me? I was trying to sort of, how would you explain this to somebody who doesn't know what MSP is, climate, et cetera, et cetera? And so to me, MSP is like a collective puzzle. We're trying to put the pieces together. see how they fit together, make compromises, trade-offs. Does this go here? Does this go here? How do we get the overall picture? Now, ClimateSmart MSP, under climate change, the puzzle pieces are starting to change size. They might not be fitting together anymore. The table might be moving. Your stakeholders are changing. You've got different people coming to the party. So you need to adapt your approach. So we're not reinventing anything. It's a huge history, as Julian pointed out, of MSP, of tradition, of people having experience in this. But we need to adapt what we're doing to take account of a dynamic paradigm, essentially. So Martha very nicely, I think, pointed out some of the key features. It's data-driven, but it's new sorts of data. It's climate data. It's climate change scenario data that we need to be building into this process. It's adaptive and dynamic. So we need to be monitoring, refining, having feedback loops into what we're doing as part of this process. We need to be taking into account the new spatial needs, and that means bringing in these new partners. It's the offshore renewable energy. It's the nature-based solutions. How do they fit into this puzzle? And it's also about ocean climate literacy, right? I mean, MSP was always very focused, or still very focused on building ocean literacy and using the NSP process as much as the product as a way of building capacity. And now we need to change that and build on that and refine that so it's ocean climate literacy. And we can be using the process to really help educate and build capacity.
So, benefits. I think, keywords are certainty. I think certainty in investment, and that's obviously extremely important for private sector. It's risk mitigation. It's having that ability to be able to project a little bit into the future through forward planning. In terms of mitigation benefits, obviously it's now you can start thinking about mitigation from the outset of the process of planning your coastal and marine spaces. Where again are these pieces of the puzzle going to fit? How can industry now be given that certainty to make the investments that are so needed in offshore renewable energy or other types of solutions? And the same goes for adaptation. It means that we can be thinking about resilience, we can be thinking about adaptation, about nature-based solutions from the outset of some of these discussions. So they're not add-ons. We're not trying to fix this on after the process, but we're building it in from the outset. So I think it's essential to be able to have that forward vision and to be able to adapt to this new world that we're all living in.
Thank you so much, Alison. I really like the puzzle analogy. That's really, really helpful. The puzzle pieces are changing. We need to adapt the puzzle pieces. New people are getting involved in the puzzle. So thank you very much for that. And also apologies to all those tuning in. I am seeing that there have been some audio issues. So I hope it's getting a little bit better now so that you can all follow the discussion. I'm getting some thumbs up, so that's great. So I'd now like to pass back over to you, Jay. Thanking you also for being awake at this very early hour in the US. So Alison has outlined some of the benefits, some of the opportunities around ClimateSmart MSP, around risk mitigation and forward thinking. But we've also had some discussions, with you as well. What could be potentially some of the challenges around upscaling this kind of model? And what are also some of the challenges generally that you're facing as an industry player, particularly in the US, around this topic?
Well, sure. Thanks for the question, Martha. So there's a lot of challenges, obviously. Like anything that is very complex and multidimensional, there's a number of things that have to be solved or have to be addressed in order to, make things happen. And of the challenges, we identified really kind of three big areas that we wanted to focus on in the roadmap and putting together the recommendations. One is just the need for financing for MSP, that MSP needs to be seen as an important part, marine spatial planning, MSP as an important part of the overall implementation of a comprehensive renewable energy portfolio, and allowing and leveraging that the development of those really important aspects toward climate change. So capacity building is another thing, and how do we scale up the marine spatial planning from something that nations do or entities do for specific projects to a national and international and in fact global approach to use of the ocean. The other thing that we found was that stakeholder engagement is one of the most important parts of marine spatial planning, incorporating the interests of all of the different users of the ocean and ensuring that as many of the interests are incorporated as possible. And so the development of a community of practice approach, as opposed to simply a stakeholder outreach, where stakeholders are involved in the process in a much deeper way than just inviting them to come in and comment on a document that's been developed. So from the ground zero, getting the stakeholders and the communities of practice that are involved in ocean use to come in early to the process. And then one of the bigger issues, because of the scale of what we're talking about, cross-boundary issues and are a big issue. Thinking about where and how marine spatial planning, how does one plan and conduct a planning exercise when you're crossing all kinds of boundaries, both international and national boundaries. And so incorporating the rules and regulations and taking into account those rules and regulations of different entities is a real challenge in terms of developing a true marine spatial plan that works from both a local and a global perspective.
To finance capacity building, to set up a marine spatial plan and ensure that that financing is available. And just on the community of practice note, we actually had a really lovely meeting this morning all around offshore wind and biodiversity, so a bit more specific. And here also, this idea of a community of practice or the need to share knowledge and information around this topic really came out very strongly. And, you know, incorporating the planners into that, so having that wider community of practice, you know, is clearly, you know, a key enabler for, you know, spatial planning, both on national, regional, and this global level and cross-boundary level, and that Jay quite rightly referred to. So thank you very much for that. You also referred to engagement and stakeholder engagement, and I think this leads us very nicely onto our next speaker. So I'd like to turn to you, Yok Kon Hyung. You are the Director of Marine Environment Research, and you've been at Korea Maritime Institute, and you've been working a lot around public acceptance and planning large offshore wind farms in Korea. And here we'd be really interested to know, you know, how does the engagement work with representatives of the offshore wind industry, and how is that working in MSP processes?
Thank you, Masha. Can you hear me? Okay. Hello, everyone. It's great to be able to meet and talk with the people who are attending the climate change conference. Recently I'm working on siting of offshore wind farms and social acceptability, as well as the marine environment. I would like to talk focusing on questions 7 and 6 assigned to the panels today, with a very practical experience in doing MSP with offshore wind farms. I think these two questions are about what information is needed to explore the location of offshore wind power, and who is the stakeholders in establishing a marine spatial plan for wind farm in ocean. Recently, interest in offshore wind power has been very high also in Korea. In particular, it is because Korea is promoting policy to reduce fossil fuel use and expand renewable energy. The 2030 greenhouse gas reduction roadmap of Korea, released in 2016, suggested 37% reduction target compared to BAU in 2030. And in the 2018 revised roadmap, maintained the same reduction ratio, but set the 2030 emission target to an absolute value, not based on BAU anymore. And finally, in 2020, the president of South Korea himself declared carbon neutrality with a vision to reduce greenhouse gas emission in 2050. The most important means of promoting carbon neutral is to supply energy that does not use fossil fuels. Renewable energy such as sunlight and wind should be used as an energy source. It is also true that Korea, surrounded by sea, has a large area of sea area, more than 4 times that of land. So there is an expectation that offshore wind power can become a promising source of energy for my country. Currently, but there is only 2 offshore wind farms that generate electricity in Korea. Jeju and another area, both of them is very small one, just began to operate in 2017 and 2020 respectively. But it took about 10 years to complete the first offshore wind farm in Korea since the government announced the offshore wind roadmap in 2010. I also have been thinking about why it took so long. I would like to mention 2 issues about this. This is consistent with the intention of questions 7 and 6. First of all, for countries that first start offshore wind power, we do not know exactly how we are using the sea before promoting offshore wind power. Although the main routes of ships are known, most of them follow the customary route, and the route has not been determined legally. The size and frequency of use of the routes are very diverse and different. Until offshore wind power was discussed recently, there was no serious concern about which route and how ships would use it. Last year, Korea announced a government plan to revitalize offshore wind power. Accordingly, I'm working on exploring the location of offshore wind power, such as the UK's round system. In this process, we were able to find out the information on the various sea use activities has not been systematically managed. First of all, it was necessary to look into whether there was a protected area or a legally difficult place to use in the sea. These areas were protected for various purposes, such as environment, cultural values, fishing, etc. Since several ministries designated the protected area according to their own respective purposes, the first thing to do was to integrate all the spatial information from all relevant ministries. Although information on fishing area and fishing vessels movement or fish information on major routes of container ships exists, there has been really need to manage and utilize that information. Moreover, as the Korean Peninsula is divided into north and south, there was a several military purpose area in the sea. This is a major impediment to the use of sea area, such as offshore wind power. The fundamental problem is that it is a first for all stakeholders that a large-scale structure such as offshore wind farm will occupy the sea area for at least 20 years. This means a new situation that stakeholders of fishermen and shipping industry have never encountered before. When the information on the fishing area was first uploaded to the information system, interestingly, it was the first fishermen who questioned the reliability of the data. It is understood that fishermen are reluctant to reveal their major fishing area. Fishermen would have wanted to keep their fishing area more secret. However, through the process of exploring the location of offshore wind power, we were able to confirm the information that had been overlooked so far, which will be a very useful experience when we have to assess the new use of the sea in the future. I know that countries such as the UK, Germany, Netherlands, and Denmark, which are already leading offshore wind power in the North Sea, have had a similar experience ahead of us. Korea has just started offshore wind power and has experienced various trial and errors. However, I hope this kind of trial error will not be repeated in other countries and set a good example for them. I'd like to express my gratitude to the Global Wind Energy Council, Global Compact, and UNESCO for inviting me to this honorable meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds like here, and as we kind of spoke about a little bit in the roadmap, that, here the offshore wind industry, really has an opportunity to galvanize these processes. It really has the opportunity to ensure that to galvanize marine spatial planning. And by siting offshore wind farms, it's an opportunity to incorporate and engage with affected stakeholders and use this as an opportunity to do so. So thank you very much for sharing that. I'd also like to just mention to the virtual audience and audience, please get some questions ready as we will about to be going into a Q&A. But one final question to you, Alison. Now, you did mention the Ocean Decade, the United Nations Decade for Ocean Science. And seeing as ClimateSmart MSP is data-driven, it's based on the best available science, how can we use this international framework to better drive climate-smart marine spatial planning?
Very good question. Always happy to talk about the decade, as you know. And we have brochures at the back as well. So please do take one on your way out. But yeah, the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development started in January this year. It's a UN-led initiative, but it's much, much broader than the UN system. It's really a framework for galvanizing, to reuse this word, diverse actors from industry, from NGOs, from the scientific community, from government, from philanthropy, around generating and using the science we need for the ocean we want. So it's a very broad ambition. And to break it down, we have 10 Ocean Decade challenges, one of which, challenge number 4, is very pertinent to what we're talking about here today. It's about generating the knowledge and the solutions for a sustainable and equitable ocean economy. And you cannot do that without MSP. And now you cannot do that without ClimateSmart MSP. So the decade already has a very strong link to ClimateSmart MSP. And I think it's not only about what can the decade do for MSP and ClimateSmart MSP, but it's what can ClimateSmart MSP contribute to the decade as well. And so those are the two sort of issues just quickly that I'd like to delve into. So in terms of how I think the decade and the framework that it provides can contribute to ClimateSmart MSP processes, data. I mean, that's the key one, the first one, right? But it's not just data as we may traditionally think of it. It's about all sorts of ocean knowledge. So yes, it's about the oceanographic data, but it's also about the social data, the economic data, indigenous and local knowledge, different cultural values, the different ways of looking at the ocean. And through the decade, we already have 31 global programs that are underway, ranging from fisheries, which my colleague just referred to, through to the deep sea, through to the mesopelagic, generating data. All of those programs have committed to making their data free and fully accessible through different data repository network. So there is going to be an amazing wealth of new information over the next 10 years. It's also about collaboration, right? So we hope that the decade can provide a framework to bring together actors, again, from all these different sectors to be talking about these same issues in a neutral space and looking at the ways that we can be learning from each other, exchanging processes. Again, my colleague Dr. Yuk was talking about, let's hope that trial and error doesn't repeat itself. Let's learn from each other. Let's learn from the experiences that you've had and use the decade also as a framework to share those experiences. Capacity development. We talked about ocean climate literacy. That's one of the other Ocean Decade challenges is all about capacity development. It's all about behavior change. It's about ocean literacy and climate ocean literacy. There will be opportunities for capacity development to occur with different communities, for people to get engaged and to really build skills in different areas. I think then, there are already these, as I said, these 31 global programs. We've got over 80 different projects working. There's a second call for decade actions, which is currently open now until the 31st of January next year, which has a strong focus on ocean climate nexus. And we really hope to see decade actions, whether they be programs or projects specifically related to sustainable ocean planning, to ClimateSmart MSP, coming up through the decade and eventually coming together in a community of practice. And again, to jump back to this term that was used before, through the Global Stakeholder Forum on the Ocean Decade, we have different communities of practice that are working together, but also working across disciplines and across sectors and so on. And then finally, how can MSP, ClimateSmart MSP, contribute to the decade? I think, the decade is a global ambition, but it's going to be implemented nationally and it's going to be implemented regionally. And I think by going through some of these ClimateSmart MSP processes, you're going to be able to see where the gaps are, and that is going to help set national or regional or transboundary research priorities that are going to inform some of the priorities and the actions that can happen under the decade. And finally, I think it will also engage new actors. If we can make that link between ClimateSmart MSP and the decade very clear, we hope that it will engage new industry partners, for example, to come into the decade and join the co-design and the co-delivery of new initiatives related to ClimateSmart MSP and other decade priorities.
Thank you so much, Alison. I mean, the decade is a coordinating framework for a number of initiatives, and I think this falls very well into it as one of them. So I'm also noting that we're a bit behind schedule, so maybe we'll have time for one question and then I'll turn over to the next panel. And I might actually just revert to you, Jay, for this one. And the question is, well, I'll rephrase it slightly. How did we measure the relevance of different stakeholders in ClimateSmart marine spatial planning? And here I think we're talking more about who are the stakeholders and why are they relevant?
Well, that's an interesting question, and obviously it has a lot of dimensions to it. The stakeholders really are all the users of the ocean and all of those that are impacted by uses of the ocean. So, the obvious ones are the offshore wind developers and offshore wind development, other ocean renewables such as tidal and wave energy generators, the traditional users of the ocean, fishing, shipping, transportation. Those are all really kind of the key parameters. But then there's the kind of the deeper aspects of the ocean and how it impacts every person on the planet, from the food that we eat to the industry and commerce that we have. And it's very difficult to prioritize what is the most important of the issues that are stakeholders that must be involved. So I think that one of the key aspects of a successful marine spatial planning effort is to involve all of the stakeholders, and then identify early where conflicts might end up being. Conflicts and opportunities, I think, is the thing that we would really like people to think about when they conduct their marine spatial planning. So from a conflict standpoint, you have fishing interests that are nervous about the aspect of offshore wind, which is a new use of the ocean, impacting their aspects of use of the ocean. But then there's the opportunities such as aquaculture that could be co-located within wind farms that could add to the the bounty that the ocean provides for the populace of the world. So I think that it's a multi-layered problem, and it's very difficult to say that there is one particular stakeholder that is more important than the other. I think that in any particular geography, there will be a series of stakeholders, and those stakeholders that have the sort of most difficult adaptation opportunities are the ones that probably get focused on the most. But I think that a good marine spatial plan needs to also think about all those uses, including the biodiversity component.
Yep. Thank you. Hello. Thank you very much, Jay. Great answer. So I'd like to close this first panel now. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you for joining us early in the morning. And thank you for being here in person, Alison. So with that note, I'd like to welcome the moderator for our second panel, which is all around, which actually takes us very nicely, I have to say, Jay's answer to this panel, because this is all around fostering coexistence. So Jay has just talked about some of the stakeholders that need engaging with in marine spatial planning processes. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about that coexistence. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Minna Epps, who is the director of the Marine Polar Program at the IUCN, another acronym, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So thank you very much, Minna.
Thank you, Martha. Can you hear me? It helps switching it on. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Martha, for excellent first part panel. So I'm very much pleased to be able to moderate the next session, which is going to look at kind of fostering harmonious coexisting in emerging regions of offshore wind growth. So we have a mixture of a panel. Some are joining us here live in person, and we also have online. So online, we have Xavier Guillou, who is the policy officer for marine renewable energy at DG Mare, so the Director General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries. Very warm welcome to you. Thank you. Thanks for being with us. Also online, we have Vera Agostini, who's the Deputy Director for Fisheries and Aquaculture. Thank you very much for being with us, Vera, and I hope you can hear us well. Also here with us live, we have Jan Mathiasen, so please, if you can join me up here, so I don't have to feel so alone. He's the director for offshore wind at the Carbon Trust, and you've been getting your feet wet for the past 12 years, so that's great. Looking forward to hearing from you as well. And last but not least, we have Vivek Patek, who is the director and global head of climate business, joining us. And he's from International Finance Corporation. And you also have a long history and a long experience with the IFC. So very warm welcome and thanks for being here with us today. So without any kind of further ado, we've heard lots of importance and mapping out and laying out from Alison what is marine spatial planning and the importance of stakeholder engagement. And I think, you know, wind industry, renewable energy is a very interesting topic because there's lots of different parameters. I mean, there's the end of life. There is also looking at mitigating wildlife wildlife disruption, but also habitat. And really think that marine spatial planning is for renewable energy offers a framework to really look at how do you minimize or mitigate those impacts on habitats. So, and now adding the ClimateSmart to this angle, I'm very pleased to be here as well as the launch of the roadmap. So I think I will start, probably I'll do a first kind of check-in with some of you in terms of what does ClimateSmart marine spatial planning mean to you, and what would potentially be the benefit of this approach? How do you feel, Vera, about that? Marine spatial planning, ClimateSmart marine spatial planning, what does that mean to you? And what would be the benefit of this approach?
So sorry, Mina, did you direct this question to me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, very nice to be here with you. I'm sorry that I can't be there in presence. It would be a lot more fun. In any event, what does ClimateSmart marine spatial planning mean to me? Well, to me, it means first and foremost, forward-looking. We are so used to operating in the here and now with our frame being static. Anything we do in a ClimateSmart planning process should anticipate what the future will look like and build a plan that takes that future into account, obviously. Not easy to do, but something that more and more we're just thrusted into having to do. Now, I want to just go over a few high-level items that I believe ClimateSmart planning processes needs to consider and need to make room for. One is an obvious one, and some of the panelists from the other the early part of the session spoke to, is it a shifting framework? What the world looks like today is not what the world will look like tomorrow, both the resources that are in the ocean, but also the way that people live. So this really should be at the basis of any marine spatial planning process that's ClimateSmart. Both the governance should keep that in mind, and the science at the heart of MSP needs to be guided by the shifting framework. The second I want to talk about, and as I said, I'll just talk about three, is that we need to prioritize space for climate mitigation and adaptation solutions. And I know the roadmap obviously is a big proponent of this. And things like offshore renewable energy, of course, are one of those solutions, but also, as Jay was also mentioning, nature-based solutions are critical. We really need to support the resilience of marine ecosystems, as well as help them to provide the benefits that we know they can provide, which include climate adaptation solutions. So one of the biggest things that I personally don't hear as much about, that I think we need to hear more, is the fact that we know that climate impacts on the oceans will change the distribution of fish and habitats. So we really need to help harness that science that examines what those changes will look like and bring it to an MSP context by designing solutions that address and take those changes into account. I think this is one of the most difficult pieces that I just have not seen enough work on. Then the third and last thing I'll say is about the socioeconomic dimensions that, of course, we all know are critical, and its speakers have said that, but they have to be really considered in a climate change context. We are not going to have the same number of people in the same places in the future. We know there are going to be migrations, population growth. So not only do we have to think about providing jobs for the people we have now, which should be inherent in any MSP process, but we also have to try and imagine what places will look like years from now and plan with that in context in mind. And this is another thing that I have seen very few plans do to date. Thank you.
Climate change, whether it's fisheries, adaptive management, fisheries sector, across sectors. But Xavier Guillou, what about you? What is marine spatial planning or ClimateSmart marine spatial planning? What does it mean to you? And what do you see as a kind of a concrete benefit of this approach?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone from Brussels, all of you in Glasgow and online. Very pleased to be there with you. Maybe first to recall that at this point in time, maritime spatial planning is certainly a crucial process to address both climate and biodiversity challenges. And I mean, it is deeply rooted in an ecosystem-based approach, and it encompasses strong stakeholders and citizen consultation. So just quickly on the European Union side, to recall that we have put in place a first legislative framework on maritime spatial planning. And this year, 2021, is an important year in that respect. All EU coastal member states have prepared at the same time, and that's an important element, at the same time, a maritime spatial plan, which includes a strong cross-border component. So there's certainly a key role for public authorities in this planning process, and maybe first and foremost because the sea is a public domain, unlike on land. So it is the role of public authority to decide also what type of use and license, on which condition activities should be prioritized and deployed at sea. And also because, as mentioned also earlier on, in addition to existing activities that are important as providing food from fishing, aquaculture, transport, defense activities, and tourism, there are two essential and growing variables, I would say, related to the maritime space: protection and restoration of biodiversity, and offshore renewable energy. And for offshore renewable energy, we know that the technology is there and working, or is being developed with floating wind, wave, and tidal. We know that the maritime energy industry have demonstrated its ability to deploy large and complex offshore wind projects. So the crucial issue now is planning and anticipating access to space. So in terms of benefits of maritime spatial planning, I would say it's first an important awareness raising process. It certainly helps to make understand that things will change and that this should be visible on the mapping of the use of the uses of the ocean. And in practical terms, we see that it brings together different ministries, different organizations that were not connected. If we take the energy industry, it's mainly a non-land industry, not an offshore industry. So it is a switch in perspective to move energy system offshore. And it's also force and push different stakeholders to think beyond national border. So I think in terms of added value and what is next, as mentioned by Vera very well before, we need to move from an already short, medium-term planning to medium-long-term to encompass our different targets in terms of marine biodiversity and energy transition. And this is complex, but this is the only way forward to secure this this development. Again, this is not about the technology; it's about visibility and access. We have space at sea more than on land. I think it's important to recall. There's land, in particular in continent like Europe, which is very dense. There's more space at sea. Doesn't mean its access is easy, but maybe it's easier. From the EU side, we believe that there's a lot of learnings that can be made to save times and do things better and quicker. Certainly, to recall, there's an entry. We see that there's an entry cost for countries to set ambitious target and to start deploying activities at sea, and this shouldn't be undermined. But probably we can do things faster by learning from one another. In the way we engage with stakeholders, we engage with citizens, in the way we know about interaction with the marine environment, but also with fisheries. And I think there's a wealth of knowledge that is documented in a number of countries that can benefit the larger community. So I will maybe stop here, but happy to jump and contribute in the follow-up discussion and question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Xavier, for giving us DG Mare's perspective, highlighting some of the complexities. But I also liked your point about, let's think beyond national borders. And even if you say that, it's less crowded at sea, the sea can also be a very crowded space. They estimate the IPBES that only less than 3% of the ocean is free from human disturbance. So I think that's also very important to bear in mind. And I think that, you've talked about marine spatial planning, and it really offers a great opportunity for kind of cross-sectoral synergies, but also the potential conflict. And I know that you've alluded to, or you mentioned fisheries a few times. So I was wondering, Vera, maybe I can just quickly come back to you, since you've been working on fisheries and aquaculture. And, could you maybe share some best practices around engaging with fisheries and offshore aquaculture stakeholders during the kind of ocean planning processes? Could you just very briefly share some of your experience there? Thank you.
Sure. So first of all, I have to say that upon reflecting on this question, I feel like those are two very different stakeholders, fishers and offshore aquaculture farmers. So for now, I'm going to focus on fishers in the interest of time, but I'm happy to entertain questions related to aquaculture. And frankly, best practices for fisher engagement are similar to the best practices for all stakeholders. But I'm going to highlight 3 best practices, as there are some fisher specificities, let's say fishery specificities, that emerge as an important part of engaging with fishers. The first one is tailor their approaches for participation. And what do I mean by that? We all know participatory approaches are critical for a successful marine spatial planning process, and that ample resources need to be devoted to that. But how we support participation of stakeholders needs to take into account the diversity of stakeholder types that come to the table. So for example, for fishers, the activities to engage them, we cannot engage a fisher in the same way we engage offshore wind executive or somebody who's working in that space. Often for fishers, of course, it depends on the kind of fisheries we're talking about, but for most fishers, They, not spending hours at sea means lost income. So one needs to get creative about how to design and implement marine spatial planning meetings to engage fishermen. I personally have run some pretty creative meetings on docks and late in the day, for example, when the fishers have returned from sea. But again, it depends on the fisheries, obviously. The second I want to highlight is use of information to support engagement. As we all know, information flow between the people managing the marine spatial planning process and the stakeholders is critical. Now, to bring another example for a project that I led in St. Kitts and Nevis, our approach to mapping fisher activities in the seascape created an opportunity to discuss the overall project with the fishers and to communicate their preferences for marine engagement. So information and creating information can be used as a vehicle for fisher engagement. It helped them really see, visualize where their most valuable fishing areas were, and communicate their preferences through that process for fishery management. Now, the last thing I'll mention is that, another good practice for fisher engagement is to build diverse databases that capture both the ecological as well as socioeconomic characteristics of a marine space. Often we have a lot of information about the ecological attributes of a system, but the socioeconomic data is more limited, or it's buried, or it's not spatial. So filling those gaps, particularly for fisheries or any use sector, really is pretty critical. And now, of course, there are always time and budget constraints inherent in any MSP process, and filling these gaps is a challenge. So we have to think of methodologies to collect new data, which includes, of course, local knowledge, and building spatial databases that represent the many uses. And I know Alison spoke in the first part of this event, and of course, the UN Decade on Ocean Science holds a lot of promise to help develop these kind of tools. So, in closing, in terms of how you engage fishers, I want to mention that really fisher engagement is one of the greatest opportunity that a marine spatial planning process is presented with, as it really will help us leverage the deep knowledge and commitment that fishers have to the ocean space. After all, they're the ones who spend probably the most amount of time on the ocean and know it really well. So given the right approach, I have found fishers to be some of the best partners and allies in effective marine spatial planning processes. Thank you.
A little bit behind schedule time now. We want to hear from all the speakers, but thank you very much for kind of giving that perspective, looking at the fishery sector. But I want to turn over now to Jan to see from your perspective, or from the wind energy perspective, what is your views on this, please?
Yeah, maybe just I agree with everything that was said, but maybe just to add that two points there. I think engagement is obviously critical, and we have heard this before. I think engagement very early on in the process is critical. So already, if policy priorities are set, then stakeholders need to engage. And then also it should be a continuous process. It should not be a one-off engagement. An example is Flow, that is a group in the UK. It's a fisheries liaison for offshore wind and wet renewable. It's a group that brings together offshore wind farm stakeholders and fishery stakeholders. Was set up in 2010, I think, so it's running for a long time already. And it basically creates a forum to discuss concerns, to exchange information, exchange data. And they developed a best practice guide that forms guidelines on how to engage. So I think that is important, to create this collaboration groups, to have this continuous collaboration. Another aspect, I think, is to try to align benefits, align objectives. What I mean here is an example. I was reading yesterday that once the North Sea was covered by 20% of the North Sea was covered by oysters. They had a decline of 95%. So 95% of decline of oysters. So now there are research happening to reintroduce oysters in offshore wind farms. And that obviously creates new opportunities for jobs, for economy, but it also stabilizes the seabed. And one of the big concerns for offshore wind farm developers is scour, is basically movements of the seabed. So then suddenly you're aligning benefits. You're aligning benefits for offshore wind farm developers, stabilizing the seabed there where the wind farm is, and you are creating opportunities for new jobs and economic opportunities. So aligning this sort of aspect, I think, is another example where benefits can be created.
Thank you very much. And I think that's so really kind of think about that. I just wanted to know before we move to Vivek, if you had, Xavier, a very short reflection on how to reconcile different kind of industry objective with the wind energy sector for kind of multi-purposes use. If you, very short, if you have an addition. Thanks.
Yes, very shortly then. Maybe just on fishing, because I'm working with a department in charge of maritime affairs and fisheries. So we are on very daily, weekly basis, or very regularly in contact with this sector. So I think there's continuous communication there. Maybe to recall, there's a number of cases, and majority of them where there's no conflict because it's not happening in the same place. And then for a number of them, consensus is found either by changing, adapting the design of some parks that still enable to reach high capacity output of production, that there are solutions already found. Usually points that are being raised and that needs to be documented and knowledge to be shared is about what is the impact on the fisheries activity during installation period, about especially on commercial species. So I think there's certainly an interest from both sides to put knowledge in common and to be able to document that. And certainly in countries where the process is at early days, to be able to say we know how we can model what is likely to happen, and we can find ways to mitigate this. And I think that's really the impression of that we have already a quite strong basis of knowledge about this interaction, either during installation phase and also during the production phase. And maybe last point, when we talk about multi-use, and I'll stop there, is also about multi-use of multi-technology platform and hubs, where you can maybe optimize the use of the sea space by mixing up different technologies. We mentioned offshore wind, but also wave and tidal energy that could maybe get a better use of the space. Thank you
very much. So we've been talking about, we're here at the COP, and we know that nature-based solutions, there's a lot about talk and buying in, but looking at the kind of climate finance, I mean, it's about 3% that goes to nature-based solutions. So I really want to hear from the IFC, if you, Vivek. So for example, how do you see that marine spatial planning can actually help and unlock some investment into offshore wind, renewable wind?
Sure, thanks so much. So just by way of background, I'm with the IFC, and we only work in emerging markets. So I'm going to give you an emerging markets perspective. And we were the first investors in wind energy in emerging markets, and we financed almost 4.5 to 5 gigawatts so far to date. And many of these were actually the first investments in wind. So we worked very closely with governments, with regulators, with NGOs, CSOs, and all the stakeholders to come up with plans on how to do it best. And we also used our environment and social guidelines, which are today pretty well accepted and adopted around the world, actually. So the difference between wind and offshore wind, I mean, we all know one is the costs. So, you can go out and do your wind analysis and you can put up a wind farm, and, sometimes the ENS impacts are not properly assessed. But the challenge we have with offshore wind is that it is expensive and it really requires a lot of planning. And that's where I think institutions like us come in, because we want to get it right, obviously. So A is using MSP is how do you assess the environment and social risk? Very important there. And once you've done that, then you can probably attract capital from people like us here. Because these are highly risky, I don't think we're going to get in a lot of commercial, because A, the size is so big and it's highly risky. I don't think you're going to get in traditional commercial capital from day one. I'm confident and I hope this will happen 5, 7, 10 years down the line, like we've seen in solar, like we've seen in wind. So getting MSP is going to be critical to assess the risks, to understand which are the right sites, what are the seabed conditions, where is the best grid connectivity, and getting that entire picture in place is going to be critical. Because if you don't have that in place, I don't think investors are going to come into these sort of projects. So therefore, the planning stage and getting that MSP right is going to be critical. Going to the next step, I think now one of the challenges that we have is that planning can take long, even in the most advanced countries. So what do you go and tell a country, it's going to take me 4 years to plan, so please put your plans on hold in the meantime. And therefore, I think we need a practical solution. Can we do some sort of a rapid environment and social sort of test or assessment to see which are the really highly risky areas, both environmentally and from a biodiversity perspective in terms of critical habitat? And then you do your detailed MSP in parallel, and hopefully that will make us, I hope will help us in avoid making mistakes. So in a nutshell, planning is going to be critical, getting the right environment and social sites or the areas which are least prone, and grid connectivity, good seabed conditions. That's how we're going to be able to attract capital, I think, at least in the initial years.
Yeah, so that's interesting to say. So we want to have something that we can fast track, or a self-assessment, a rapid tool, like a flow, the one we've been doing every morning to speed things up. Yeah, but also you mentioned a risk, because you said these are high risk, and obviously that's very closely coupled to investments. But do you see there's any potential risk of kind of slowing down MSP development in emerging markets in terms of offshore?
So I think, as I was telling your CEO before I came in, is whether he said it is perfection is the enemy of the good. So I think that's really the challenge is, if governments want to get it perfect, you have to wait. I don't think the populations and industry is willing to wait. At the same time, you want to start decarbonizing. So I really think that working in parallel, I suspect, will probably be one of the better solutions. It will expose one to risks. It's not going to be risk-free, obviously, compared to a detailed MSP, but at least you can avoid the really high-risk areas and hopefully get the work started in the meantime. And so the other thing that we're going to need in order to de-risk or reduce the risk or the costs very often is blended finance, and which is what we did in onshore wind, in solar in the early days. So that is going to be a really critical piece of the, I wouldn't say climate puzzle, of the financing puzzle, is to get that piece of blended finance in there, which will help de-risk some of these projects, so bring costs down initially. And then over time, as people get used to it, I'm hoping we'll reach the same stage like solar, where tariffs are down. And in a lot of countries, you really don't need de-risking capital for solar.
Yeah, I think that's really key. How can we actually help and foster these, early developers and movers? So we've actually set up a Blue Natural Capital funding facility to help move it before they are investable or can get larger investment from other sources. So I'm looking at you, Jan. Do you have anything, listening to Vivek, what he said, some kind of reflection, something you would like to add to this?
Yeah, maybe just looking at it maybe from a little bit practical point of view. I think data, we mentioned data already earlier. It's critical. It's a foundation of marine spatial planning. So if you look at new markets, I think there's a risk that there's maybe not the understanding of what data is required, what's the quality of data that is required. Coming back to the puzzle, it may be then that the puzzle, we can't get it together, or the puzzle pieces don't fit together because the quality of the data isn't good enough. So I think having the data and getting the data, and it will take time, it takes cost, is really critical, and also to speed up the process. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. So this has been really interesting and inspiring listening to you. And I'm before I hand over the word to Martha, who's will then also give us some instruction what comes after. I hope you can stay around for a bit longer as well to maybe interact and answer some questions. We actually did have a couple of questions online, which unfortunately we don't have time, but just to mention that one was really pointing out the nature. It's not just, it's three-dimensional, the ocean. So how do you really incorporate like the vertical, all dimensions? And of course, we have to look at those impacts below as well, and the water column. And I'm sure that is also addressed with when you do all this assessment. So I think with that, I would close this panel and hand it back to Martha. And thank you so much as well, Vera and Xavier and everyone else on the line who's been listening. Thank you so much. A round of applause for our great speakers. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Min. And can I also just extend my thanks to Vera and Xavier? Lovely to see you on screen. Wish you were with us, hopefully next time. Lovely to see you, Vera. And thank you also, Jay, on the line there. So we're nearing the end of this event. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are just going to have some final remarks that will be played on the screen, sadly, by another visit guest who wasn't able to be here in person. And this is Amanda Lefton, who is the director at BOEM, the Bureau of Energy Ocean Management. But I believe there's some short remarks that will be played shortly. And just also to say, as Minna mentioned, please do stick around. There's actually some food outside, which is exciting. Can't promise too much, but hopefully those that are here in person, and please do stick around and enjoy that with us. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome on the virtual screen, Amanda Lefton from BOEM.
Good afternoon. I'm Amanda Lefton, the Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. On behalf of the U.S. Department of the Interior, thank you to the UN Global Compact for inviting me to provide a U.S. government perspective on ClimateSmart marine spatial planning. Since taking office, tackling the climate crisis has been a key part of President Biden's agenda. Developing offshore wind energy is a critical element of this plan. Earlier this year, the Biden administration set a target to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which would create nearly 80,000 good-paying jobs while protecting biodiversity and promoting ocean focus. Meeting this goal will help the U.S. carve a path to reach net zero emissions by 2050. In addition to its 30 gigawatt by 2030 goal, the Biden administration also set an ambitious goal to protect at least 30% of U.S. lands and waters by 2030 in our America's Beautiful initiative. To ensure successful ocean planning, governments must have access to authoritative data and the tools for analysis, transparent for
And apologies that you champions, my dear friend Ignace, just to provide some closing reflections on the day so far. So over to you, Ignace, and then join us for some food. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. I don't know if I will give some reflection on the day, but at least on the session, I think there is 3 elements that really struck me, that beyond climate smart, it's also about economic smart, social smart, and being nature smart. Economic smart, because we know that investing in renewable energy and the future is creating economic opportunities. It's delivering on the SDGs. We know that the ocean can provide us with more food, more energy, more transport, and more medicine. MSP is also social smart, because working with the communities that will be impacted by the new operation in the ocean is also make sure that the fisheries and others are benefiting from this new development. I think being social smart is also the way that we can develop technology at scale and with the pace that we need to see, but it's very important that at the same time we associate it with the social acceptability. If we develop technology too fast without making sure this is just and equitable for all, this will certainly not work and deliver the ambition we have set. Finally, nature smart, indeed reconciling clean energy policies and technologies with nature is at the center of the solution. And we've heard today really often nature-based solution, and I'm really happy for this. At COP26, ocean is really at the nature, first of all, is really at the core of it as part of the solution. We know that we have to tackle simultaneously the climate and the biodiversity crisis if we want to deliver this net zero and resilient future. Ocean, as Marta mentioned, is on the agenda today very prominently, and I'm very happy for that. It's the first time. We are launching the Ocean for Climate Declaration, which sets the path for action on the ocean for climate, with more than 120 signatories already from businesses, science, the UN, and cities and region. So this is really building the foundation for much more action and work on the ocean in Glasgow. So know that we have the momentum, we have the structure and the organization to convene the people together. We have targets, and we heard about the very exciting target of 380 gigawatts by GWEC and ARENA. So now let's turn that into action. And I think there is 3 key enablers that we need to activate. First of all is blue finance, as we have heard. Science and the decade is critical here. And finally, of course, ocean management, with using MSP as a key tool to deliver on that. I wish you all a very happy and exciting Ocean Day and a good afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. We can have some lunch.